Reminder: the following video discusses political topics with real-world parallels. Remember, it takes Paizo about a year to make each book, so any real-world parallels seen in this book are likely coincidental. Hello YouTube and welcome to Prime Productions. I'm here to help enhance your tabletop gaming experience. If you're new to this channel, I primarily cover Paizo tabletop role-playing games like Pathfinder and Starfinder. And of course I have a Patreon and Discord, more info at the end of the video. So there's been a lot of releases around Paizo recently, and one that may have flown under the radar are the Hellfire Dispatches. So I thought I would take a second to talk about them today. By the way, Paizo provided me with a free review copy of this book, but there were no strings attached, and I am in no other way being compensated. So before we get started in on the book, some background. The Hellfire Dispatches are part of a larger company-wide event in Pathfinder called the Hellfire Crisis. The Hellfire Crisis involves 2 whole pre-made campaigns, several one-shot Pathfinder Society scenarios, a novel, and a slew of other things. If you want more about the start of the Hellfire Crisis, I did a video about it last year, link in the description below. Anyway, one of the books in the Hellfire Crisis line is the Hellfire Dispatches. Like I said, I've talked about the Hellfire Crisis before, but to sum it up, the crisis is about this country called Cheliax going to war with this country called Aroden, and this country, Isgeear, is caught in the middle. Cheliax is a massive, fascistic, autocratic empire full of literal devil worshippers. Also, Cheliax has a massive navy that will be important for later. Aroden is a democratic republic who, while they certainly have corruption and scandals, is at least not fascistic or devil worshipping. Isgeear is a puppet state of Cheliax, but there are a number of people clamoring for their freedom. Anyway, an international incident occurs in Isgeear that kicks off a war between Aroden and Cheliax, and that is the Hellfire Crisis. And I'll talk more about this event later in the video. Anyway, this book covers the broad strokes of the 7 so-called fronts of the war. But this book doesn't just talk about the war, it also talks about player options, new enemy stat blocks for GMs to use, and some other things, so let's get into it. Now, before the book gets into the 7 fronts of the war, it does give a rundown of how we got here. That is to say, the state of Cheliax, the state of Aroden, and the international incident that kicks everything off. By the way, the framing device for this entire book is a series of in-universe fictional articles and letters written by in-universe characters. Some of the notes are between smugglers, some are newspaper articles. It's all kind of a tapestry to give you an idea of what's going on. Also, there are brief sections that just tell you what the leadership structure of the various places are, in case you need a who's who of what's going on. Now, the first section of the book gives you info about the 2 major military factions of the war, the Hell Knights and Eagle Knights. Now, before the war, the Hell Knights and Eagle Knights were paramilitary forces, with the Hell Knights mostly being devoted to Cheliax and the Eagle Knights devoted to Aroden. But the 2 were technically independent of their countries. As the Hellfire Crisis starts, her infernal magistrix, Queen Abigail Thrune II, leader of Cheliax, tries to nationalize the Hell Knights. She kind of half succeeds as several Hell Knight forces decide to join with her, and the Eagle Knights meanwhile go to war for their home country of Aroden. This section has the newly revamped Hell Knight archetype that is just a massive archetype with a whole lot of options, as well as 3 new Eagle Knight archetypes to represent the 3 different branches of the Eagle Knights. And if you want to play a Hell Knight fighting against Cheliax, you can. There are some Hell Knight orders that are vehemently opposing Thrune's hostile takeover. For example, most of the Order of the Scourge, who want to root out political corruption, view Thrune's nationalization of the Hell Knights as a gross overreach of power. Okay, so let's get into the 7 fronts of the war. So the first front I want to talk about is the Arch of Aroden. This is this little section here, which is basically like the real-life Strait of Gibraltar. Now, there used to be a bridge that connected the northern continent to the southern continent, but it has fallen into disrepair and is no longer usable. More pressing, though, is that it is a major sea trade route, and now Cheliax, who controls the strait, is blocking any non-Cheliax ships from going through, which blocks trade not only for Aroden, but also Absalom and Taldor and a bunch of others. Now, trade isn't completely blocked off. There is a way to trade going this direction, but it would add weeks or months of travel time. Complicating matters is Rahadum. See, Rahadum is this country here, and they are basically an anti-theocracy. Worship of gods is banned there. However, Cheliax controls the city of Kari on the very tip here, basically so that they can control both sides of the strait. So when Cheliax blockaded the strait, they unwittingly pissed off Rahudum, who they kinda need to be friendly with because they want to keep both sides of the strait. Now, Rahudum is thinking of taking Kari, remember that's on their side of the strait, in a coup. As of this book, it hasn't happened yet, but it is a brewing conflict and a problem for Cheliax. Also, several Rahudumi are starting to smuggle stuff through the strait because they don't want trade cut off to half of their country. So yes, it looks like the Pure Legion, who are basically Rahudum's anti-religious inquisitors, are looking to take over Kari. Corresponding to that, we have the Pure Legion Enforcer archetype as a player option, as well as stat blocks for a Pure Legion troop, as well as a Pirate troop and a Hell Knight troop designed to recapture escapees that's in this section of the book. But in blocking off all this trade, Cheliax isn't only hurting Andoran and Rahudum, but also themselves. This is explained in the second warfront I'm going to talk about, the Inner Sea. So continuing our real-life parallels, the Inner Sea is basically the Mediterranean Sea from real life. Only in Golarion, this version is open at both ends. Now, as I said earlier, the Cheliax Navy vastly outpaces the Andoran Navy, but they are running into some issues. See, the Chelaxian tendency to be jackbooted thugs about stuff, coupled with their blockading of the Arch of Aroden, has caused many people to stop trading with them. There's a whole section of missives about how rampant suppression of Andoran trade and the suspicion that someone might trade with Andoran is having a chilling effect on Chelaxian trade. Also, the blockade is just not terribly effective. See, it turns out that there are some ships from Kadera that can turn into like magic submarines, and they are circumventing another different blockade from a different country in order to trade with Andoran so that Andoran can get military supplies. So, I mean, it looks like Cheliax is shooting themselves in the foot for very little gain. And at the end of the section, there are several ship statistics you can use for your home games, as well as a cool underwater privateer archetype. Fun story, this one can get you an increased swim speed. Finding a way to increase your swim speed isn't terribly common, so that's a nice little feat. But back to the blockade. Another reason that it's not terribly effective is that it is drawing consternation from probably the most important city in all of Golarion, Absalom. And that's actually the third front in the war, kinda, sorta. If you don't know, Absalom is the largest city on 2 continents, possibly the entire world of Golarion, and it is the largest trade hub in this section of the world. So, as one might expect, closing off the Arch of Aroden is of big concern to them. Now, Cheliax may be good at shooting themselves in the foot, but they aren't completely stupid. They are trying to make political inroads into Absalom to get the city on their side. And of course, Andoran is doing the same. So far, Absalom is remaining neutral, but that doesn't prevent both sides from using propaganda and politicking to try and win favors. Now, you may be asking, if Cheliax is blocking trade to Absalom, why would Absalom remain neutral? And the answer is that Cheliax is really good at propaganda, framing the conflict as something that Andoran brought on themselves, and saying that Andoran is asking Absalom to sacrifice their navy because Andoran doesn't want to fight. Which is, of course, not true. Andoran is absolutely willing to fight. They just need more ships to contend with Cheliax's much larger navy. Also, side note, the island that has Absalom has another smaller port city called Diabel, and that is kind of like Absalom's seedy, less regulated twin. Andoran has resorted to using Diabel smugglers to bypass the blockade, go down to this pirate area down here called the Shackles, and then bring back pirates to aid in the fight against Cheliax. Now, these Shackles pirates typically hate Cheliax, but, I mean, you are importing lawless pirates to the area, which historically has not gone well. There are 2 player options in this section, both have to do with archetypes. The Absalom Dandy is an expansion of the existing Dandy archetype, and the Starstone Aspirant is a new archetype. For those who don't know, there is a magic rock in the center of Absalom that, like 99.9% of the time, unalives you. But some say if you pass some sort of unknown test, it turns you into a god. Starstone aspirants study and train to pass this supposed test that, might not actually exist. The next front to talk about is the Isgeear front. Now, I'm not going to discuss the war in Isgeear too much because this book discusses events immediately after the adventure path Hellbreakers, so it has spoilers. In fact, I want to play Hellbreakers, so I avoided reading it as much as possible. but I can give you a quick history lesson. Now, I've talked about this on the channel before, but Isgeear is essentially a puppet state of Cheliax, with all the nobles in Isgear signing lucrative deals with Cheliax that are good for the nobles, but are bad for the country. Anyway, some Hell Knights under the direct orders of Thrune run roughshod over Isgear looking for an insurgent group. Andrin sends a diplomatic envoy to stop them. The Hell Knights execute the diplomatic envoy on trumped-up charges. International incident. Cheliax and Andrin go to war. That's the start of the Hellfire Crisis. This section does have stats for even more troops for your GM to have you fight against. Man, loving all of these troop stat blocks. Love to see more of them in the game. Also, there is the Sisterhood of Golden Irenes archetype. This archetype is from a group of evil Chelaxian battle nuns who were sent to Isgear years ago to run orphanages. It was all a very thinly veiled attempt to recruit orphans to become loyal Chelaxian soldiers. And it partially worked. It seems to be some sort of monk-adjacent archetype with stances and stuff, but I think a few other classes could make it work, especially because it gives you access to and proficiency in the Asp Coil, which is a decent weapon. The next section is Dispatches from the Wall, which is actually called the Aspodean Wall. This is basically like Galarian's Great Wall of China. It runs from the inner sea here to this mountain range here, providing an effective way to prevent a huge number of troops from moving through the area. Sure, magic could teleport some people up or over the wall, but not like 100,000 troops, at least not in any reasonable amount of time. Commissioned years ago, it was built by gnomes who kept changing the wall's design and style every few years, and eventually construction stopped. But when the war ramped up, it was completed in rapid succession. It's implied that Cheliax fired the gnomes who were making it and just summoned devils to complete it, but I don't think the book outright says that. Anyway, there are controls on the Cheliax side to open up the gates and attack, and obviously not on the Andrin side, making this wall a really great defensive structure, as the Chelaxians can march their troops through whenever they want, and even hide them massing troops on the other side, but Andrin can't do the same. I should note that the wall is not perfect. There is talk of a mountain pass somewhere along here that lets people circumvent the wall, but it's supposedly narrow and treacherous and not great for marching troops through. As always, this section contains some GM and player resources. There are yet more troop stat blocks, including a troop of gnome sappers and a troop of devils. Also, there are more feats for the Snarecrafter archetype that focused on making magic traps, as well as new magic traps to build. The second to last section is about Nidal. Now, the story of Nidal is long and complicated, but basically, Nidal is under the control of the evil god Zon-Kuthon due to an ancient 9,000-year-old pact. Zon-Kuthon, of course, is the god of many nasty things that I probably shouldn't mention on YouTube. Look, his followers look like this, and his religious symbol is chains going through a skull's eye sockets. What do you think he's about? Anyway, Nidal is perpetually gloomy. Even when it's daytime, there is very little color, and in some parts of the country, you can't even tell night from day. This is all due to the magical pact that people made with Zon-Kuthon 9 millennia ago. One last thing about Nidal. There are essentially two factions in it. There is the faction that has completely given over to following Zon-Kuthon, and they're all sadists and they do his bidding and all that. Their side of the country rules through something called the Black Triune. They also have a group of shadowcasters or shadow magic specialists that are all evil and stuff. On the other hand, you have the standard citizenry who are repressed and hate Zon-Kuthon and don't have any hope until recently. You see, after the god Gorham's death, one citizen named Eraticus found a shard of his armor, forged it into a super powerful deific spear, and has been running around on horseback creating a super fast cavalry to fight the Black Triune and their ilk. She's called the Horse Lord, and she is stirring up trouble for the Black Triune and their government and recruiting more Horse Lords to her cause. Now, it's important to note, the idea of Horse Lords has always been a cultural touchstone in Nidal, but this woman with the Gorham Spear is reinvigorating them. Now, what does all this have to do with the Hellfire Dispatches? I'm glad you asked. You see, until recently, the governments of Nidal and Cheliax were relatively chummy. Cheliax sends devil-worshipping clerics to help with Nidal's problems, and Nidal sends shadowcasters to help with Cheliax's problems. It's win-win, or rather lose-lose for the rest of Galarian. Now, with the war, Cheliax could really use shadowcasters to teleport around and spy and stuff, and with the Horse Lord business, Nidal could use some Chelaxian clerics. But with both countries occupied with their own problems, their ability to aid each other is greatly diminished. This means that Anduin has a vested interest in keeping the Horse Lord Rebellion going in order to occupy the Shadowcasters so that they can't aid Cheliax. It also behooves the Horse Lord to keep Cheliax occupied so that they can't send clerics to aid the Black Triune. It's a big quagmire of politics, and it's really interesting if you're into that sort of stuff like I am. As with other sections, there's some mechanical stuff if you want. There are stats for a cavalry troop of horse lords, as well as Zon Kuthon, let's call them enthusiasts? Also, there's an archetype to be one of those Nidalese horse lords. Now, the final front, and I use that term very loosely, is the Fangwood front. Honestly, I wouldn't even call this a front. See, the Fangwood is pretty far from the Hellfire Crisis, fighting up here. These two countries are Nermathis and Multhun, and they used to be a part of Cheliax until a bit over 100 years ago. Then they separated into one country, but the southern half of the country immediately mistreated the northerners, and so in short order, the north part of the country broke off from the southern part, and the two have been fighting ever since. I mean, the fighting waxes and wanes, but currently fighting is on. Compounding matters, they both had to deal with a hobgoblin invasion a few years back, which resulted in a third nation, Oprak, in the mix. And now the Whispering Tyrant and undead demigod Superlich is trying to attack them from the other side. Man, these two cannot catch a break, can they? So what does any of this have to do with the Hellfire Crisis? Well, honestly, not much. The two countries up here are just fighting at the same time as the Hellfire Crisis. Now, there is a token mention that refugees are fleeing up to Multhun and Nermathis to get away from the Hellfire fighting, only to be caught up in a different war, but that's about it. I mean, Cheliax and Multhun are allies, but like I said in the previous section, Cheliax isn't really in the position to send military aid right now. It is important to note that there are two major players in Nermathis and Multhun right now. A daemon of war named Caesuriel has managed to get a large amount of political power in Multhun and is pushing for non-stop aggression into Nermathis. Remember, daemons are not the devils of Cheliax. Daemons were neutral evil under the old alignment system. Opposing Caesuriel is Courageheart, a divine servant of Milani. Now, Milani is the goddess of, like, righteous rebellion against corrupt and oppressive governments, that kind of thing. Courageheart is training and arming the citizenry of Nermathis to counter the onslaught of Caesuriel and Multhun. Interesting and cool idea, just doesn't have a whole lot to do with the Hellfire Crisis. There are yet more troop stat blocks in this section: Fangwood Scouts, Multhun Cavalry, Hobgoblin, Fire Alchemists. Also, there is the Rose Warden, which is an archetype for followers of Milani. Hey, it can make you sanctified holy. There's not a whole lot of things that can do that, so that's neat. Anyway, that's all from the Hellfire Dispatches. What are your thoughts? Personally, I love all the world building and politicking that's going on here. It really shows how dedicated Paizo is to creating an interesting and compelling world. Let me know what you think. Let's get a conversation going. Hey, as a reminder, I have a Patreon. I'm going to try and post something fun there once a month, but honestly, it's just a way to keep this channel financially viable. For less than the cost of a cup of coffee a month, you can help me keep the lights on. Let me know what you think. And of course, I have a Discord channel. Drop by and say hi. We'd love to talk to you. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. That tells not only me, but also YouTube that you like this kind of content and would like to see more. And until next time, thank you, good luck, and happy gaming.